As all of you are familiar that if someone knows any language like Urdu and other person knows English, and the person who knows English have no idea about the Urdu, and the person who knows Urdu have no idea about the English, then we need a translator to communicate among themselves. So there are two types of translators available. One is called compiler, and other is known as interpreter. Another type of compiler is called assembler. We have very few usage of assembler nowadays because most of the time we are working with the high level programming languages or object oriented programming language. Assembler. So what is the purpose of these translators? These are the three types of translators. The purpose of the translator is to translate the one language into the another language. So we can say that the computer is a system, and the computer system knows a language which is called machine language. The machine language is a language which computers knows. Machine language. And we are human, and we want to we don't want to learn the machine language. If you want to talk to the system, then there is one possibility that everyone has to learn the machine language and complete your task by using the machine language and give instructions to the system by in machine language. But machine language is not too easy to learn each and every one. It is basically the language of hardware. It is the language of machine. So we have to learn basically the fundamentals of physics and the fundamentals of the hardware. So instead of learning the basic levels of hardware, we have to learn the high level languages or the object oriented language. So I am just writing here a high level language. So we know the high level language, and we have to write down the instruction. What the program is nothing. Program is a set of instructions. These are the instruction number 1, instruction number 2, and so on. These are the instructions, and these instructions are to be given to the machine so that machine will read the instruction one by one and act on these instructions. So there are the two phases. One phase is instructions are given in the form of a program. So this is called code or program. This code or program is written in the high level language. Suppose I write down this program into the C++. And this C++ source code or the source code is another term which we use for this, source code. So this is the source code, but if I give this source code to the machine cannot work on this. The reason is machine does not know the high level languages. Machine know only one language, which is called machine language or assembly language. The machine language, we gave this code to a translator, and translator will do what? Translator will transform this into a exe file. What the exe file is, Exe file is a executable file. So what translator did, translator will translate this high level language first line code into the machine language first line code. Then second line code of source program is to be translated into the machine language, and so on. These codes are translated into a machine readable form, and that machine readable form will execute. So we will finally execute. Execute means what? Execute means we will run the program. Okay? So we will execute this code by the help of machine. The machine can understand these instructions which are written into the machine language. So there are the two stages. In the one stage, you have to create your source code in any high level language or in any programming language or any object oriented language. That object oriented language source code is to be translated into the machine language code, which contains the instruction into the machine language. Then in the second phase, you have to execute that. So the first phase is the translate phase. Before the first page, you have to write down the source code. The step number one is what? Write down source code in any language. Step number two is to translate the source code into the machine code or exe file. So if you translated the file into the executable form, then third step is to what? To execute the code. Execute the code, computer will read the instruction number one from the exe file and act on that. Then computer will run the second line of code into the machine, into the exe file, and act on that, so on. So these translations will be executed in the third stage. So these are the stages in our journey. In the journey of programming, we have to write down the code into the high level language. Then we have to use any translator to translate the code. Either I can use interpreter or we can use compiler. Assembler is used if we are writing the code into the assembly language. So generally the compiler, C++ has a compiler, but some languages has interpreter. Like if I am working with the any programming language like BASIC, so BASIC has interpreter, but C++ has compiler. So it's on you, either you are using the interpreter or compiler. Some languages has the both of them, interpreter and compiler, both are available, but some languages has specialized translators. Suppose C++ has compiler, so we have to use compiler to translate our source code into the machine code. And in third stage, we have to execute the code by running the exe file. So we use the term run the program for it. To run the program for it means what? We have to execute the program. So these are the stages in a programming language. We need any compiler or interpreter to translate, and C++ has a translator which is named as compiler. So initially we write down the source code. Source code contains the instruction, and it generally has extension of CPP, C++ file. The source code contains the instruction in a CPP file, you have to write down these instructions in any text editor, plain text. We cannot use MS Word for typing these instructions. We can use Notepad to write down these instructions. The Notepad can be used for the purpose of writing these instructions. Or we can use C++ GUI, graphical user interface. Okay? GUI you can use for the purpose of typing the program. So this file is nothing, it's just a text file. And in this text file, we have to write down the line of codes. Each line representing a specific code. And in the initial stage, this file is to be transformed into the object file with the extension .obj. And then in the next step, this file is to be transferred or transformed into executable file, .exe file. Computer needs the exe file. Okay? There is an intermediate stage which is called object file, and the final translated version of the file is called exe file. So we have to convert the file into the last stage, and that stage is the executable file. So you have to write down the code first, then you have to convert it into the object file, exe file, and then execute or run the exe file. Acha, what is the difference between the interpreter and compiler? In the interpreter, the first line is taken by the interpreter from the source code. Then it is translated into the machine code, and that line is executed. So the execution and the translation is to be performed simultaneously. I'm repeating it. First line is translated first into the machine code. So we have here. And that translated code is executed. So before translating to the next line of code, the interpreter will run the previously translated line first. If there is an error in the line number 1 during translation, so that error to be shown at the screen, and the process will not be continued before this error has been removed. Suppose I have an error in line number 1. So during the translation of line number 1, on the screen, it represents that error, what the error is. The error code is to be shown. And up to you have to remove that error first. Then the translation procedure has to be continued. Otherwise, the next line cannot be translated or not be executed. So in interpreter, the lines are translated and executed simultaneously. While in compiler, all the source lines are to be translated one by one, and execution process will not be continued until the last line of code has been translated. So all the lines are to be translated first. If there are some error, so it will not break the operation of translation. It will show you the error in line number 5, error in line number 25, error in line number 63. All errors are shown during translation. And now the user has to remove all of these errors. And then these errors are, after removal, the translation is started again, and if all errors are rectified accordingly, then now the exe file is formed and have to execute these line of code. Compiler will run one by one and execute that. So that is the major difference between the compiler, working of compiler and interpreter. The errors are three types of errors we have. Number one, syntax error. Second one is called logical error. And the third one is called runtime error. Runtime error. Okay? So there are the three types of error: syntax error, logical error, runtime error. What is the difference between these three? As I gave you the example, to bring a glass of water, and I wrote the spelling of glass as KLASS, glass. So this type of error is called syntax error because the word glass will not be found into the dictionary. The word KLASS is not found in the dictionary. So the English language translator will not translate this word into the machine language, and this will be an error. That type of error is called syntax error. The syntax error is what? These are the purely the language error in which we do not follow the rule of the language. Either the rule of the language will not be followed, or we have uh, spelling errors. The spelling errors will also be the syntax error. The syntax errors are those errors which we do not follow the rule of language. Suppose I have to write down a sentence like purchase rubber, pencil, copy, sharpener from stationery shop. So I have to use the commas in between that: rubber, pencil, copy, sharpener. So I miss the commas. The commas are very necessary in the language. In English, you can understand without the commas, but compiler cannot understand the such things, because if it is defined that you have to specify the few things which are separated by comma and the commas are missing there, compiler will not translate that. So this will be the syntax error. But what the logical errors are: suppose I have to write down a formula y is equal to a plus b. That is the actual formula that I was required to write down into the code. But by mistake, instead of a plus sign, I used a minus sign in typing. So instead of adding these two terms, the compiler will subtract that. So there is no error in this line because this is not a syntax error. Compiler cannot detect the logical error. The reason is it is true. Either how compiler will find that I actually want to add them instead of subtraction. So adding is a correct rule, as well as subtraction is a correct rule. I wrote the incorrect sign, so that is my mistake. The answer will not be correct. The syntax is same, the syntax is correct, the line is correct, but the answer will not be correct in the logical errors. So it is quite difficult to debug the error. The term bug is used for the error, and the term debug is used to remove the error. Debug. So debugging is a term which is used for removing the errors. So this is quite difficult to trace out the logical error from the program. Now the last type of error is the runtime error. Runtime errors are those errors which everything is fine, the translation is fine, and exe file is prepared correctly. But when I execute or run this code file or exe file, suppose in line number 3, a print command was given. For this print command, your printer should be ready and connected to your system. But if the printer is not connected to your system, then line number 3 cannot be executed. So there is no error in the, there is no syntax error in the file. There is no logical error in the file, but it is the hardware error because that specific hardware is not available. And the program will halt at the moment and error will be identified on the screen. Connect the printer to your system so that this line can be executed. So this type of error is a runtime error. Sometimes this error will occur, sometimes it will not occur. If the printer is properly connected to the system and all the hardware are working fine, so there will no runtime error. If at the other day there is no connected printer with your system, so in other day the execution face an error, but in some day when the printer is connected and the pages were there, there is no error. So this type of error is called runtime error. The runtime error is generally the hardware connection errors, like you want to save something into the floppy disk and the floppy disk is not available into your system. So at that computer where the floppy disk is available, the program will be executed fine. But in those systems where the floppy disk is not connected to your system, the program will face an error. That type of error is called runtime error. Control structures. Control structures are what? So we have to define that. Control structures, there are the 3 elements. One is called sequential control. Second one is called selection control or selection logic. And third one is called iterative control. Iterative control. The control structures and data structures. These are the 3 main elements in programming. We have to deal with the control structures. In the next semester, you will learn a course named as data structures. Or there is a possibility that you are already learning the course of data structure in this semester. I have no idea about that, right? But I have to teach control structures here. Control structures are very fundamental elements of programming. All of you have to be understand these 3 types of control structures. So what the control structures are, suppose we have a source program here. This is my CPP program, C++ file. And I have some lines of code here. Suppose line number 1, line number 2, and so on. Line number 10. Suppose I have 10 lines here. So 10 lines means the 10 instructions. If I translated the file and this entire translation is transformed into the exe file, So these are the instructions in the exe file. The 10 instructions we have in the CPP file. After translation, we have the 10 instructions in .exe file. Now what the compiler will do in a sequential control. Sequential control means when I run this program, the line number 1 will be executed first and the action of line number 1 is taken. After completing the action of line number 1, line number 2 is taken by the compiler and the action on the line number 2 is performed, and so on. The last line is to be taken and the action on the last line is to be performed. So the action will be performed sequentially in a linear pattern from line number 1 to the line number last in the process of execution or in the process of running the computer program. So this type of structure is known as sequential structure or the sequential logic, or we call it as sequential structure. So what the sequential structure is, it is very simple. You have to pass no special instruction to identify the compiler that the instructions are to be taken in the linear pattern. So it is the built-in behavior of the executor that the lines will be taken one by one from this code and actions will be performed. So this is default logic. This is also called default logic. So what is the meaning of default logic? The meaning of default logic is when I execute the program, then automatically line by line these instructions are captured by the executor and actions will be performed on all lines in a sequential way. But what the selection logic is, selection logic means at a specific point we have to take the another decision. Suppose these lines are executed sequentially, but in line number 5 there is an instruction if x is equal to 5, then go to step number 1. So in the execution, if line number 1 is executed, it is sequential. Then after completion of line number 2, line number 3 is taken and executed. After completion of line number 2, line number 3 is executed, line number 4 is executed. When line number 5 occurs, it has a condition. What that condition is, if the value of x is 5, then repeat the instruction number 1, step number 1. So if the value of x is 5, then the sequential logic will be interrupted and it comes to the step number 1 again. If x is not equal to 5, then the next instruction will be taken and follow that. So here at line number 5, we have a selection logic. Computer has to select whether the value of x is 5 or not. If actually the value of x is 5, then it follow this step. Otherwise, the sequential logic will be executed in the same way. So this is the two logics has been covered till now, selection logic and the sequential logic. The third logic is called iterative control. Iterative control is a repeated control. So you can see the repeated control here as well. if the value of x is 3, suppose, nahin, if the value of x is 5, then it will come here and the value of x is 5. Then next step, yes, the x is 5, go to the step number 1. So it means step number 1 to 4 is repeated 2 times. If again the value of x is 5, it is repeated again. If again the value of x is 5, it is repeated again. So it means the line number 1 to 4 is to be executed repeatedly. So this type of logic is called iterative control. So 3 types of control, I am summarizing the 3 types of control. Sequential logic is a default logic, and we have not to pass any special instruction to implement the sequential logic, because compiler and executor already knows that the instructions will be taken one by one. In a selection logic, we can split or break the sequential logic at any moment by passing the if. And we may execute any step after the break of the sequential logic. But after completing the sequential logic, the control will be passed to the next instruction and the next instruction and the next instruction, so on. But if at the line number last, I am writing a term, go to step 7, suppose. Line number last is executed. At the last line, it is stated that go to the step number 7. The control will move to the line number 7, and all of the lines from 7 to the last line will again executed. And this process will be continued every time. So when come to the last step, then it goes to the step number 7 and repeatedly it occurs. So when it will stop? So we can stop, suppose in line number 10, I write down a line, if x is equal to 9, then stop. So when we will reach to the line number 9, and if really the value of x is 9, then the process will be stopped and the program will be terminated. If it is not equal to 9, then the next step and the next step. And when it comes to the last line, it has a line which indicates that you have to move to the step number 7, and it will be executed again. So sometimes we need to repeat some instructions, and sometimes we need to break the sequential logic at any instance, or sequential is a default logic. Every time compiler will decide it itself, the sequence is to be followed.